Here's a question for you. What was the first ever video game? It seems like a simple enough question, but it's trickier than you think. The trouble is, you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask, and none of them seem definitive. So, let's take a critical look at the origin of video games, starting with a brief history of the popular consensus. For a long time, the most common answer to the question was Pong, Atari's 1972 arcade game. Pong was a phenomenon, the first game to break through into popular culture. And for that reason, quite a few magazines from the 80s and early 90s cited as the first ever game, such as Sinclair User in 1986, a 1987 issue of Your Computer, the first issue of ST Amiga Format in 1988, and a 1990 issue of Amiga World. Some do at least add a qualifier, such as Computer Gaming World's claim in 1982 that Pong was the first computer game of renown, similarly as the first video game for the masses in a 1987 issue of Ahoy. So there was at least some awareness of an earlier history, but not much in the way of in-depth research. I suppose it was a different era. Google wasn't a thing, and even a trip to a local library wouldn't be much use, as video games weren't exactly well documented. So, with Pong being so prominent, it was generally accepted as an origin point. And while it does mark the popular emergence of games, there lies a long and obscure history behind it. The funny thing about Pong is that it isn't even Atari's first game, never mind the first game ever. Before Atari were Atari, they were called Syzygy Engineering, and along with manufacturer Nutting Associates, they released a game called Computer Space in 1971. Computer Space was never as popular as Pong, selling maybe 1,500 units as opposed to the tens of thousands of Pong arcade machines and the millions of subsequent clones. But one of the co-founders of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, was certainly no stranger to publicity. And in interviews during the early 1980s, he was quick to point out that Pong wasn't his first game. Some of the gaming press picked up on this, reproducing his words verbatim. Big K in 1985 cites Computer Space as the first marketed video game, which might be correct. And a 1993 Amiga Format special is proud to reveal that Pong isn't the first video game after all, instead granting that accolade to Computer Space. So for a long time, Nolan Bushnell was seen as the father of video games. But here's the thing. Computer Space wasn't exactly original. It was based on an earlier game that Bushnell had played during his time at Stanford University. Again, something he freely admitted. That game was called Space War, and it first emerged in the computing labs of MIT by 1962. Unlike Computer Space, it wasn't an arcade machine. It was never intended for commercial release. It simply wasn't a viable option. It ran on an expensive minicomputer, the PDP-1, which even in a basic configuration sold for $120,000 in the 1960s. So it was a purely academic exercise, but one that was surprisingly popular on campus, at least amongst those with access to the computing lab. The July 1971 issue of Analog Science Fiction Science Fact describes it as the first true space-age game. And they aren't wrong. This was just 2 years after the moon landings. This is one of very few accounts that detail an interactive game before video games had a meaningful impact on popular culture. It's interesting to see how they treat Space War as a unique thing, rather than as part of something else. Space War isn't seen as a video game. Space War is just Space War. Over its life, the game spread from institution to institution and became reasonably well known within the right community. But it wasn't until the early 1980s that the game started to reach wider public attention. In 1981, one of the game's co-creators, Martin Gratz, wrote an article for Creative Computing, a fairly comprehensive 8-page history of its development and operation. However, it was a 1984 book that did the most to bring Space War to wider public attention. Stephen Levy's Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, detailed some of the exploits of MIT engineers over the last couple of decades, with a whole chapter dedicated to space war. So as time went on and more people learned about the game, it gained some recognition as the first computer game. Byte magazine described it as such in 1990. This reign would be short-lived, however, as another, earlier game came to light soon after. A game from 1958 called Tennis for Two. Tennis for Two was the creation of a man named William Higginbotham, an American nuclear physicist. While working at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, he created a game designed to show off the lab's instrumentation at their annual exposition. Tennis for Two was shown to the public in 1958, and once again in 1959, before being dismantled and largely forgotten about. Until 1982 at least, a mention of the game appears in an issue of Creative Computing, an article titled, "Who Really Invented the Video Game?" It details the hardware used, an analog computer with a 5-inch oscilloscope display, and goes on to describe the gameplay. It was a tennis game, not dissimilar to Pong, with a ball following a realistic trajectory as each player hits it back and forth. It was quite a convincing simulation, but considering it was using hardware designed to calculate the trajectory of ballistic missiles, that might not be too surprising. Despite Higginbotham's subsequent radio interview with NPR in '83, the revelation of a video game that dated to as early as 1958 passed most people by. Most were still content in thinking that Pong was the origin. In 1993, author Ira Flatow sought to correct this as part of his book. They All Left, a collection of invention stories from throughout history. The final chapter is all about Tennis for Two. Flatow had worked at NPR, so it's likely he's familiar with Tennis for Two through Higginbotham's interview in 1983. Sadly, William Higginbotham died in 1994, but his obituaries detailed his achievements, including his game. And subsequently, Tennis for Two became well known. The new answer to the question of what was the first video game? Perfectly satisfactory. Looks like Pong, dates to 1958. That can't be much earlier, can there? Today, if you look at Wikipedia's article on the early history of video games, you'll see mention of a 1947 invention. The cathode ray tube amusement device. Sounds like a delightfully archaic term for video games. And we can verify its existence in the patent record. Number 2455992. Submitted on the 25th of January 1947 and granted on the 14th of December 1948. Its impact must have been limited. It's only recently come to prominence, roughly as long as the existence of Wikipedia. This re-emergence can be traced to Jed Margolin's 2001 article, The Secret Life of Vector Generators. Margolin was an Atari engineer familiar with the golden era of arcade games, and crucially, is the named inventor on a number of patents relevant to early video game hardware. This 1947 patent first came to light in a lawsuit. Magnavox vs. Bally, circa 1976. The amusement device was cited as prior art in Bally's defense. So someone working on Bally's behalf must have done the necessary legwork to uncover this. After all, there was a strong incentive. Magnavox held a key patent on video games that earned them $100 million over its lifetime. And, according to the man behind that patent, Ralph Baer, video games were his invention. The man had an interesting career. He fled Nazi Germany in 1938, was drafted into World War II in 1943, and, courtesy of the GI Bill, attained the first ever BSc in television engineering in 1949. By 1961, he ended up at Sanders Associates, a defense contractor that specialized in electronic systems. In September 1966, Baer laid out his ideas for an interactive television game, and work began on a series of prototypes. These prototypes culminated in the brown box design in 1968, so named for its wood grain effect vinyl covering. This device connected to any standard television and could play a variety of games, including a tennis game that has a startling similarity to Pong, seen here in a 1969 demonstration. This was the system that would eventually be licensed and sold as the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, the very first home video game system. Everything at Sanders was remarkably well documented, perhaps because of their work for the military, but this means there's a large body of dated documentation to accompany Bear's invention. Additionally, unlike Tennis for Two at Brookhaven National Laboratory and Space War at MIT, Sanders was a commercial entity. They existed for profit and were at liberty to patent their innovations. And patent they did, with Bear's work submitted in 1968, amended while pending in 1971, and granted in 1973. US patent number 3728480. A second was filed in 69, granted in 72 and reissued in 75. Reissue 28507. Collectively, the 480 and 507 patents gave Sanders and licensee Magnavox a very strong legal right to fundamental concepts behind early video games. A right which they exploited. Magnavox filed lawsuits against Atari, Bally Midway, Chicago Coin, Mattel, Activision, and won all of them, garnering substantial licensing fees. Nintendo preemptively sued Magnavox for the US launch of the NES in 1985 in an effort to overturn these patents. They lost as well. Patents are strong, and Magnavox had precedence. Despite the legal victories, Bear was regarded as something of an also-ran in the early video game stakes. But he gained quite some recognition following the 2004 award for the National Medal of Technology. His time spent forgotten is evident in the frustrated tone of his 2005 book, Video Games in the Beginning. He lays his claim to the industry's genesis, and the disdain for Nolan Bushnell and Atari's later success is particularly apparent. He's also very dismissive of any precursors. He writes off Space War as impractical, and Tennis for Two as akin to fiddling with an oscilloscope. But it's hard to blame him. He was definitely a pioneer. Ralph Baer died in 2014 at the age of 92. His accomplishments in video games eulogized. Whether or not he invented video games, he can lay legitimate claim to the first home video game. But I feel there's more to video games than just consoles. To complicate things further, while Tennis for Two and the 1947 patent steal the limelight, anything between these milestones falls through the cracks. Take OXO, for instance, a 1952 game developed for the EDSAC, an early digital computer. It's a simple game of noughts and crosses, or tic-tac-toe if you'd prefer. Its display uses a cathode ray tube. In fact, the computer has 3 of them, used to indicate program and system status. The middle tube is normally used to display part of memory in a 35 by 16 dot matrix. But rather than store game state in binary, OXO exploited the visual memory display to create a game board, filling up with X's and O's as the game is played. Then there's Nimrod, part of the 1951 Festival of Britain, a dedicated machine designed to play the game of Nim faster than thought. Played on a bank of lights, the player and AI taking turns to remove them, attempting to leave the last light for their opponent. Bertie the Brain was another computing demonstration in the summer of 1950 at the Canadian National Exhibition. Similar to the later OXO, Bertie was a computer AI designed to play a game of tic-tac-toe on a display illuminated by an array of light bulbs. So, we have a number of candidates for the first ever game, and we've painted a picture of our understanding over the last few decades. Paradoxically, the further you go back, the more recent the consensus of the first ever video game, and everything seems to converge on Pong. As video gaming developed, so too did the appreciation of its history, and as more scrutiny was given to the limits of popular memory, the origin was pushed farther back. first a space war, then tennis for two. The principal catalyst for this interest, at least at first, were the Magnavox lawsuits, with a very strong financial incentive for someone to overturn these key patents. But as we shed more light on the past, another paradox emerges. The more we uncover, the less certain we become. So, we have a problem. There's no shortage of candidates for the title of first video game, but some of them feel like they might not qualify. To land at a satisfactory answer to our original question, we must first answer another. What is a video game? I told you it was tricky, but a definitive conclusion needs a concrete definition. Defining the video game is hard, but determining one less so. The duck test is applicable here, i.e., if it looks like a video game and plays like a video game, then we can probably call it a video game. So, Pong, video game. Asteroids, video game. Space Invaders, video game. However, with the earliest examples of games, we start to approach the edge of the definition. So we need to determine a hard delineation between video game and not video game. The way I see it, there are two essential elements. The first is a video display of some kind, and the second is interaction for the purpose of entertainment, i.e., a game. We'll start with the video part. The word comes from the Latin video, meaning I see. Think of it as a counterpart to audio, I hear. However, its modern meaning is slightly more specific. It has the implication of an electronic signal driving a visual display, distinct from film, which is projected. This normally means television, but it can also include computer monitors, oscilloscopes, and liquid crystal arrays. Any display capable of receiving a signal and producing an image. For this reason, I think we can exclude games that use indicator lamps. These tend to be electronically integrated into the logic circuit, rather than driven by a separate signal. Now, you could argue that any display is just an array of lights, and that there need not be a minimum array size. And I agree that we don't need to stipulate a minimum resolution, but on the other hand, a single light bulb doesn't constitute a video display. The key difference lies in the generation of a video signal. Video signals come in a variety of forms, but they are generally low voltage, high frequency, and transmissible between two different electronic circuits. They often have a certain timing, either a particular synchronization frequency or a separate clock, accompanied with some form of image signal. I don't think we need to stipulate any particular technical format, but for our definition of video game, we are going to need at least some kind of video signal. This means that neither Bertie the Brain nor Nimrod qualify. Their banks of light bulbs don't meet our video signal requirement. Next, consider the Nintendo Game Boy. This particular breed of handheld LCD game presents another boundary. Compare the earlier Game & Watch. I would consider this just an electronic game, but the Game Boy a bona fide handheld video game. So what's the distinction? I think both are borderline, but there is a key difference in the way the LCD displays are driven. The Game & Watch is essentially running on the same type of display as a calculator. An active liquid crystal display with a quad multiplexed LCD driver. The only difference is that the LCD segments represent gameplay elements instead of numerical digits. The Game Boy, however, has a considerably more complex screen. At 160 pixels across and 144 pixels tall, there are over 20,000 segments to control, each with 4 levels of brightness. Because of this, the signals sent to the display resemble a conventional video signal. There are horizontal and vertical sync lines, along with a 2-bit digital data channel. It's not NTSC compliant, but it could definitely be described as a video signal. And, in fact, hardware such as the Super Game Boy can adapt them for use on a standard television. If there was any doubt to the distinction, the language used on their respective patents is another clear indicator. The Game & Watch is described as an electronic toy having a game function, whereas the Game Boy is a compact handheld video game system. So, we can draw a line between the two, and we've established that a cathode ray tube is a nice to have, but not an absolute necessity. However, even when dealing with CRT displays, there are some that make the argument that not everything qualifies. Ralph Baer, for instance, is quite specific with his definition. Baer states that to be considered a true video game, the device on which it is played must generate a raster signal capable of being displayed on a domestic television set. Fair enough, I suppose, and most games do fit this definition. But it's a little too strict for my taste. Technically, it would exclude many early computer games that targeted monitors rather than televisions. But most crucially, it excludes every single vector game. While they're extinct today, vector games were an important part of the golden arcade era, including Asteroids, Star Castle, the Vectrex console, and the 1983 Star Wars arcade game. There are dozens of examples, and I can't think of a good reason to discard them. Their graphics aren't painted by a raster signal, but they are still painted by a signal, a two-axis XY signal that directly controls the electron beam's deflection. My gut says Asteroids is a video game, and so our definition of video game has to include vector displays. But this has significant meaning when it comes to answering our question. By keeping our definition broad enough to include vector video, we have to also include some of the earliest candidates. Space War had vector graphics. Tennis for Two had vector graphics. The 1947 patent would have used vector graphics. So we can't yet exclude any of them. But now we have a reasonably good sense of what the term video means, we can move on to the other essential aspect: the game. We don't need to be too strict with this definition. When we say game, what we really mean is interactive entertainment. But what our definition needs to do is separate video games from something like television itself. For instance, watching television is definitely entertainment, and to some extent it is interactive. Changing channels or simply powering the device on qualifies as interaction. The critical difference lies with the generation of the video signal. In television, these are broadcast remotely, and the signal itself cannot be changed, only switched between. With a video game, the signal is generated locally, and crucially, the player's input has a direct influence on the signal generated. The game responds to the player through the medium of video. There are some recent exceptions to local signal generation. Services such as OnLive or Google Stadia stream video over the internet. But in these cases, the player still controls the signal, albeit through an additional network layer. So, a video game must give some degree of control over the video signal itself to be considered sufficiently interactive. Next, consider a DVD menu. Technically, the video signal is altered in response to user input. Options are highlighted, and the menus are navigable in a non-linear way. All of the elements necessary for a video game are present. In fact, some DVDs even feature games, and these arguably qualify as video games. That said, however, a typical DVD menu definitely isn't a video game. So what's the difference? Put it this way: how do we separate non-entertainment software from games? Consider a spreadsheet used for managing resources versus a resource management simulator. Their interfaces might be very similar, and the mode of operation nearly identical. The key difference is intent. A spreadsheet for resource management is created to manage resources. And there are some people who find that entertaining, but entertainment is not the primary purpose. The simulator, on the other hand, can be primarily intended for entertainment. Some simulators aren't. They might be for training purposes, such as a military flight simulator. But if it's a commercial product that you can play on a home computer, then there's a good chance you can consider it a video game. The same applies to DVD menus. While they are interactive and do serve to deliver entertainment, their interaction is not intended to be intrinsically entertaining. So, intent is very important. Not only must interaction be present, but the principal intended purpose of that interaction must be some form of entertainment. So, we've covered the broad strokes, but there are some additional points of contention that might shape our final definition. For instance, does a video game need to be implemented to be considered? Is a concept enough? The 1947 CRT amusement device is only known to exist as a patent. Some sources claim prototypes were built, but there's no evidence of this. The inventors, Thomas T. Goldsmith Jr. and Nestle Rayman, did work for an established manufacturer of television equipment, Dumont Laboratories, so it's not unreasonable to assume that they had the means to manufacture such a device. But given the absence of any marketed product and the lack of any further development, it seems the project wasn't deemed viable. Now, it seems fairly logical to insist that the first ever game actually existed, but in a sea of prototypes and experiments, it's less clear-cut than I'd like. I think prototypes should still count, but our definition should only include games with evidence of a practical implementation. So is that enough to discount the 1947 device? I think it depends on how strict you are with the definition of evidence. A patent might be enough. They describe the invention in detail and are subject to scrutiny before being granted. But where the 1947 device falls flat, however, is with the gameplay itself. While it does generate a video signal that is directly controlled by the player, the game relies on other elements, physical targets on the face of the display. Without these, you're left with a triggered signal generator with an oscilloscope display. A neat novelty, but I do think this puts the 1947 device in the realm of electromechanical games, rather than that of true video games. Consider a pinball machine. Modern examples can be quite advanced, even incorporating games played on a video display. But I don't think anyone would make the argument that a modern pinball table is a video game. The core gameplay is the mechanical ball and flippers. The video display is accessory to that. Conversely, it's possible for a video game to have accessory elements. Think of an arcade game's coin box, marquee lights, etc. An arcade cabinet has more than just a video display going on, but that's not a reason for exclusion, as the primary game can be played solely through the video display. Whereas pinball relies on the mechanical elements for complete function. So, the 1947 device might be the first use of a CRT for the purpose of interactive entertainment, but its use of mechanical elements as a core part of the game means it isn't a true video game. It's an electromechanical game with a video element, and this means it doesn't qualify under our definition. Our game has to be playable solely through the use of the video display. Accessory indicators or electronics aren't reason for exclusion, but in terms of visual output, the game has to be playable by the video signal alone. And so, that leaves us with a fairly robust definition, one that consists of 5 points. Firstly, a video game must exist. It must involve some kind of video signal. This signal should be in some way interactive, and the principal intended purpose of this interactivity should be entertainment. Finally, the game should be centered on and fully playable through the use of the video displays. If a candidate meets these 5 requirements, then I think we can consider it a video game. So we have our definition. The only thing left to do is apply it. So the candidates that remain are Pong, Computer Space, Bear's Brown Box, Space War, Tennis for Two, and OXO. All of these are documented to exist, so there's no question of practical implementation for any of them, least of all Pong. In terms of video signal, Pong, Computer Space, and the Brown Box generate a raster signal suitable for an NTSC television, whereas Space War, Tennis for Two, and OXO generate an XY signal for display on an oscilloscope or vector monitor. OXO's display is a little contentious. While it did use a cathode ray tube and it was driven by a signal, the display wasn't really intended to be a graphical one. In fact, the cathode ray tube wasn't chosen because of its display capability at all. In the early days, CRTs were used for storage. One implementation was called the Williams-Kilburn tube, and it relied on a curious side effect of energized phosphors. Once lit by the scanning electron beam, a charge would persist for a fraction of a second. This secondary emission could be sensed, and the phosphor recharged on the next scan, meaning you could store an array of a couple of thousand bits indefinitely. This was presented on the face of the display as a grid of illuminated dots, the electron beam scanning rows in a fairly similar way to a raster display. However, a sensor sheet on the face of the tube did cover up most of the visible pattern, making this arrangement less than ideal for use as a display. But quite often, a second tube would be connected in parallel without the obstruction. EDSAC, the machine that ran OXO, didn't use a Williams tube for storage. It used mercury delay line memory instead. But the contents of this memory were displayed on a diagnostic CRT in the same manner. So, while it was never really intended to be used for graphics, the fact is, it was, and so, it still qualifies. Back to the candidates. In terms of interactivity, I think most here count. Again, the only possible exception is OXO. Because of the limitations of the display, OXO is considerably less dynamic than the other examples, with the display only updating when a move is made. That said, the display does change in response to player input, so it is interactive, if not exciting. Intent is the fourth criterion, and it's fairly clear that Pong, Computer Space, and Bear's Brown Box were all intended for entertainment. That was their ultimate commercial purpose. Space War was definitely a diversionary pursuit, and is frequently described as a game. Tennis for Two was an exhibit intended for public display, and it may have had an ulterior motive to kindle an interest in science, but the prime appeal was in the playing. Now, OXO. OXO was the product of study at Cambridge University, a practical proof as part of a thesis. If we take it as part of a PhD, the work is purely academic. But I think it's fairer to judge it on its own merits. As a piece of software, it stands alone as what could easily be described as a computer game. So while entertainment isn't the purpose of implementation, it was the purpose of playing. So the final test. Can the game be played with no other visual output than the video display? Pong and Computer Space qualify without question. They are undoubtedly video games. Few would argue otherwise. You could say that the Brown Box's use of screen overlays for some of its games disqualifies it on this point. And there is some merit to this in cases where the plastic overlay is absolutely necessary to play. But for most of the games, it's not. Just an accessory. And the basic tennis game doesn't have an overlay at all. So, the Brown Box gets a pass. It's a video game. Space War ran on the PDP-1, which was a modular system with a range of potential visual outputs. The CRT monitor was central to the game, but it wasn't the only output that Space War used. In some versions, game scores were printed. However, these aspects are secondary to the actual gameplay. So Space War is a video game. Tennis for Two is simpler. Its only output was the oscilloscope display, so it is a bona fide video game. What about OXO? Like Space War, it ran on a full computer system, with its CRT display, line printer, and banks of valves and dust blinking lights. The question is it possible to play a full game with only the video display? The answer is yes, with the caveat that you have to know what you're doing. If you memorize which number corresponds to each grid position, or at least make use of a printed reference, then it's entirely possible to play without any other output. It's clumsy and archaic. Your moves are input on a rotary telephone-style dial. But poor controls are no reason to discount it. There are plenty of video games with terrible controls. So OXO is, without doubt, a computer game played on something which can be described as a video display. Under any reasonable definition, I think that qualifies as a video game. It might even be the first. However, to be sure, it might be worth further investigation. A closer examination of the environment that spawned OXO may turn up some other potentials. What we think of as video games really comprise multiple strands. Arcade machines, television games, electronic games, and more recently, virtual reality and mobile games, which have rapidly become a significant part of the video games industry. When we tease out these strands, the reason why it's so difficult to pin down the first video game becomes apparent. Each of these strands has its own history, its own progression, and its own origin. If we look at them individually, the picture becomes much clearer. The first arcade video game. It's either Computer Space or Galaxy Game, both from the end of 1971. The first television game. Ralph Baer's Brown Box. The first electronic handheld video game? It could be the Game Boy, unless you count the Atari Lynx prototypes from 1987. The first virtual reality video game, possibly played via the VPL Research iPhone in 1987, or the Virtuality from 1991, although research in head-mounted displays goes all the way back to the 1950s. And the first mobile game, Tetris, on the 1994 Haganuk MT2000. Nokia's Snake gets an honourable mention. So when we split video gaming into its components, the question becomes much easier to answer, and the oldest strand becomes obvious. It's computing. The first video game was almost certainly an early computer game like OXO. It's just a question of determining the earliest example that qualifies. The good news is, computers weren't exactly common in the 1940s and 50s, and fewer still had video displays. In the brief window between the invention of the Williams tube circa 1946 and OXO in 1952, there are 7 potential machines. 3 of these potential computers were located at the University of Manchester, where the Williams tube was developed. The first was the Manchester Baby, operational in 1948, a prototype which was replaced by the full-scale Manchester Mark I in 1949. This, in turn, was developed into and replaced by a commercial model, the Ferranti Mark I, operational in early 1951. There were 2 other British machines, the Pilot Ace at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, London, operational in mid-1950, and EDSAC at Cambridge University, which was first operational in 1949. At this time, the Americans had 2 machines with a video display. The Whirlwind 1, built by MIT for the US Navy, partially operational in 1949 and reaching full capacity in 1951, and the Standards Western Automatic Computer, or SWAC, located in Los Angeles. It's impossible to know every program that ran on these early machines, but most of them are fairly well documented. Access was exclusive, and programs were filed in a job queue. There was normally a paper trail, and there was an incentive for institutions to highlight their machine's accomplishments. Unfortunately, this transparency and a need to justify the computer's existence meant that games were a very low priority. Starting with the SWAC, a commercial machine, we can see most applications were either pure mathematics or scientific in nature, such as searching for prime numbers, developing climatological models, the X-ray analysis of vitamin B12. Processing time was split between the Institute for Numerical Analysis and other government agencies. It's very unlikely that there were any games made for the SWAC. Next, the Whirlwind 1 was part academic, part military. It was intended to be used as a flight simulator, not a graphical one, but as something that could simulate aerodynamics and control flight instrumentation. In addition, it was used for industrial process control, air traffic control, and to demonstrate the potential of computerized air defense. However, half of the computing time available was allotted to MIT for engineering and scientific calculations. And here, there is evidence for slightly less serious use. Whirlwind's capabilities were quite remarkable for the time, with a generously sized CRT display capable of real-time graphics. It was demonstrated live on American television in 1951 in a Christmas episode of See It Now. It even played a rendition of Jingle Bells. Later, in a 1953 film, Making Electrons Count, we can see Whirlwind demonstrating a bouncing ball program. It's the real-time calculation of 3 differential equations, but in practice, the CRT traces a convincing trajectory of a ball. This demo dates to as early as 1949, but it doesn't count as a video game due to a lack of interactivity. However, some sources claim that there was a version circa late 1950 to 1951 that did have a degree of interactivity, with the player able to adjust the ball trajectory in order to make it drop through the hole. Unfortunately, there's no evidence of this. The claims are anecdotal, undated, and might be misremembered. So we must presume that the Whirlwind's bouncing ball was a non-interactive demo and not a game. Next, the EDSAC at Cambridge, which we already know played host to OXO, but was far more frequently used for scientific purpose. Atomic wave functions, astronomical equations of motion, crystallography and the structure of myoglobin, and economic modelling. So much more than a simple game of noughts and crosses, but OXO is what we're interested in. Although I should mention, OXO is not the original name of A.S. Douglas's program. He referred to it as a game of noughts and crosses in his 1954 thesis. The OXO appellation seems to be a product of a preservation effort by the EDSAC replica project. While Douglas didn't give an exact date for the program's creation, he did specify that it ran circa 1952. So, for the purpose of primordiality, we must assume the worst. The earliest date that we can be sure of is the end of 1952. If we wanted to be really cynical, we could take the date that Douglas submitted his thesis, March 1953. In either case, this means that OXO, or noughts and crosses, remains the prime candidate. But was there anything else done with the EDSAC that could take the crown? It turns out there is a whisper of another game, attested in the thesis of Stanley Gill, which was submitted in November 1952. That would put it ahead of OXO. It was a game of sheep and gates, the screen vertically divided by a fence with 2 gates. A procession of sheep approach these gates, and you must open the correct one by interrupting a light beam in EDSAC's tape reader. Primitive? Naturally. And sadly, there are no photos. But it qualifies on the same merits as OXO, and does so with an earlier verifiable date. But let's not draw our conclusions yet. More machines remain. The Pilot Ace at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, London, boasted strong floating point performance, ideal for the heavy scientific computations it was used for. It was a prototype machine that wasn't particularly easy to program, but it was still fast, calculating integrals and prime numbers with aplomb. It's here that I should introduce a man named Christopher Strachey, a student of mathematics and physics at Cambridge, and by 1949, a schoolmaster at Harrow. In early 1951, he was introduced to Mike Woodger at the MPL and given access to the Pilot Ace machine. His work here was inspired by a June 1950 article in Penguin Science News, A Theory of Chess and Noughts and Crosses, written by Donald Davies, the ACE project lead at NPL. The article was a mathematical breakdown of the decision-making and rules that governed games like chess, part of the newly emerging field of game theory, led by computer scientists like John von Neumann. This was the dawn of artificial intelligence, and there was a great interest in teaching these so-called electronic brains to think, to teach them how to play games. Strachey was a teacher, and he decided to undertake this implementation. Not noughts and crosses, as that was too simple, nor chess, for that was far too complex. Instead, he chose the intermediate game of drafts, or checkers if you prefer. With only two types of piece, men and kings, and only half the squares traversable, it would be feasible given the confines of early computer capability. Of course, programs for these machines were planned on paper before being compiled on punch tape and executed, which meant that Strachey didn't have the luxury of debuggers, breakpoints, or anything like that. He would have to write and check his code manually. He finished a preliminary drafts program by May 1951, but it wasn't until the 30th of July that Strachey had the chance to run his program for the first time. It didn't work. However, by this time there were more capable machines out there, and the computing project at the University of Manchester had made considerable progress. They had a full-scale production machine delivered in February 1951, the culmination of 5 years of development. The first of the Manchester computers was the Baby. This was designed as a testbed, in much the same way as the Pilot Ace, so its practical use was limited. There were some exercises in pure mathematics, highest proper factors, long division, and other arithmetical facilities. But it wasn't long before the machine was rebuilt into a more expanded form. The Manchester Mark I was a full-scale computer which, while still a prototype, started to see more serious use, including the calculation of Mersenne primes, investigation of the Riemann hypothesis, symbolic logic, ray tracing, and Laguerre functions. Even so, it was a short-lived computer, quickly replaced by its commercial version, the Ferranti Mark I. Eventually there would be 9 such machines made, including a later revision, but the first Mark I went to the University of Manchester. Here it served the university's computing needs until its replacement in 1959. Notable uses include calculations for the Armaments Research Establishment, the British nuclear weapons programme, and the development of Mark I autocode, a higher-level means of programming the computer that was widely used. The Ferranti machine also saw some work relating to games. Dietrich Prinz developed the first-ever chess-playing program in November 1951. It wasn't a video game. It didn't use the Williams Tube display for any graphical purpose. But it was only a matter of time. Back to Christopher Strachey and his implementation of drafts. Strachey first learned of the Ferranti Mark I in the spring of 1951, and quickly took the opportunity to write to Alan Turing, describing his interest. In return, Strachey received a copy of Turing's infamously opaque programming handbook for the Manchester computer, and an invite to see the machine for himself. He first visited Manchester in July, and over the next year, between careful study of the handbook and occasional visit, he familiarised himself with the machine, ran some programs, and forged a reputation as a formidable programmer. But as much as he had mastered the technical side, there was something of an artistic streak that ran through his work. He made the computer play music, composed love letters, and in the summer of 1952, he successfully ran his revised drafts program and played a video game. His implementation worked. The computer was able to play a complete game of drafts at a reasonable speed. Generously, he even took pictures of the video display and published his work. So, what does this mean? It means the first video game is Christopher Strachey's Drafts, first implemented circa 1951, but confirmed working complete with evidence by no later than July 1952. Also, video games are a British invention. In any case, we have an answer. There are, of course, a couple of caveats. Firstly, to be clear, Strachey's Drafts is the first video game for which we have evidence. It remains possible that there was undocumented work prior, but we can only draw conclusions from the evidence we have. Secondly, our assertion only holds true as long as you subscribe to the definition we laid out. A looser take might include the 1947 device, or maybe something even earlier. That said, I think our definition is robust. One thing is clear. The 1947 device has had zero lasting impact on video games, long forgotten until it was dredged up during the Magnavox lawsuits. Christopher Strachey, on the other hand, was a bit of a pioneer. His 1952 presentation at the University of Toronto inspired Arthur Samuel's later work on machine learning. Strachey developed the CPL programming language, an important ancestor of C. His influence is broad, and it permeates computer science. In regards to the first video game, I was equal parts pleased and dismayed to discover that I wasn't the first to arrive at this conclusion. There are two others. One is Jack Copeland, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Canterbury, Christchurch, New Zealand, and an authority on the life and work of Alan Turing. As a product of his detailed research into early computing history and Turing's correspondence with Strachey, he describes the operation of Strachey's Drafts program and calls it the world's first computer game. It's not the first computer game, but we can assume he means the first computer game with a video display. The second to draw this conclusion is Alvy Ray Smith, co-founder of Lucasfilm's computer division and Pixar. His 2015 article, The Dawn of Digital Light, is a detailed examination of the origins of computer-generated digital images that makes some rather bold statements. The first digital picture, the first computer animations, the first video game. He ranks Strachey first, Gill's Sheep and Gates second, and Douglas's Noughts and Crosses third. I'm inclined to agree. In broader coverage, Strachey's Drafts is sometimes included in the early history of video games, but is seldom upheld as the champion. It's a difficult call to make, given the lack of a universal definition of video game, and the rather ragged margin at its furthest extent. But I feel as though we have our answer. The mid-20th century was a real frontier for electronics. By 1950, transistors were in their infancy, and integrated circuits were a decade away. The only place video games could have started prior to the age of Pong was in the computer lab. Here there was high technology with no concern for commercial viability, and vast budgets were approved, ostensibly for more serious computations, but the games slipped through the cracks. But here's the thing. Nobody called these early computer experiments video games, at least not at the time. It's a retroactive label, given only once video games had pierced popular culture, and the term video game dates to later than you might think. So, one final question. When did video games become video games. A search on Google Books Ngram Viewer gives us an idea of the time frame. The term emerged at some point between 1970 and 1975, coinciding with Pong's early success. This is borne out with a search through the popular gaming press, scarce as it was in the 1970s. The February 1976 issue of Byte magazine uses the term Pong-style video game in a familiar way. A broader search of literature on Google Books doesn't turn up anything prior to 1975. However, Google Newspapers does have a 1974 feature on space-age pinball machines that details the rise of the new coin-operated video games, which means the term must have started to gain traction by this point. There's a 1973 article in Business Week that must have been written just after Pong had found early commercial success. It describes a red-hot market for video games, in what might be the earliest instance of the term in a major publication. There are also a couple of false positives that crop up. A 1974 issue of New Scientist uses the term to mean video business, as in the video game. It was around this time that the first video playback devices were hitting the domestic market. Earlier still, there are some surprising mentions of video game in the 1950s. But it turns out this is an older term for televised sports games, back when such a thing wasn't universal. It's increasingly clear that Pong is close to the origin. So let's skip straight to the source. Here's the promotional flyer for the 1972 Atari arcade game. The newest two-player video skill game. From Atari Corporation, Syzygy engineered, the team that pioneered video technology. So in 1972, Pong was described as a video skill game, which is almost, but not quite, what we're looking for. There is a definite emphasis on the term video. Atari's next game, Space Race, released July 1973, does use the term video game within its flyer text. And later that year in September, the flyer for Pong Doubles featured it prominently at the very top. Atari's new video game. So 1973 was the year that the term video game shot to prominence and was fixed within the arcade lexicon. But where's the first use? In researching this, I found a particularly good post from the Golden Age arcade historian titled The Etymology of Video Game. It confirms our suspicion. Atari and Pong are very much at the centre of the term, tracking the first use in the trade press to March 1973. Interestingly, there is also a letter from Nolan Bushnell to John Britz at Bally, dated July the 10th, 1972, in which Nolan uses the term. This might be the first documented use. It seems video game was the term used by Atari to describe their new product to potential purchasers, venue owners rather than players. So, two things. The term video game dates to around 1972, reaching wider popularity by 73-74, and it seems it was devised for the benefit of the arcade amusement industry, as a marketing term to distinguish this new class of machine. So while Nolan Bushnell can't take credit for many original ideas, it seems he is the man that named the industry, and the one that kickstarted its commercial success. There's an argument to be made that the first video game was the game first described as such, and it seems the answer to that is Pong. Pong was the catalyst, and Atari's games are likely the main reason we use the label video game to cover all kinds of interactive entertainment. If Pong had failed and it was the 8-bit microcomputers that found the earliest success, then computer games might have been the definitive term. In fact, in certain regions at certain times, this has been true. But the Americans settled on video game, and their influence means most of the world has adopted the term as the standard. It's far divorced from its original meaning. The term meant to distinguish early arcade games from their electromechanical counterparts. But it seems it's stuck, and has since been applied to all sorts of things. Computer games, arcade amusements, television games, handheld electronic games, mobile games, and virtual reality. What we know is video games don't have a single origin. They're a constellation. So if anybody asks you, what was the first ever video game? You could tell them it was Straight Cheese Drafts, 1952. But it might be easier to say, it was probably Pong or something. Because, well, it's trickier than they think. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, farewell.